You're not gonna move your seat up, are you?
No.
It's a callback!
Welcome to In the Comics, a series where I take movies and TV show episodes that are either based on a specific comic, or take elements from one or more comics to make an adaptation worth talking about. And the next episode of this was going to be Batman The Long Halloween Part 2, but then it suddenly occurred to me that that's going to leave me with no uploads for a month, and no. And for whatever reason, I started rewatching Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which is a show I originally felt fairly ambivalent about. Like a lot of Marvel outings, it had likeable characters, brought up some really interesting ideas, but ultimately just failed to stick the landing with them. And that's why I originally didn't have anything to say about it when it first came out. But in rewatching it, there is something I definitely want to talk about. Say hello to Baron Zemo.
Hello.
Now, this is a villain that I originally didn't know that much about, which is strange because he can easily be considered Captain America's second most famous villain. Name another Captain America villain that is not Red Skull. I dare you. And in the Civil War, it looked like they were doing that annoying thing where they just create their own character to service the story they're telling and then just say, what famous character's name can we put on this? Zemo will do. And if we had only ever seen him in Civil War, that would be a fair critique to have of the character, but I went back and I read quite a few Baron Zemo stories, and with Falcon and the Winter Soldier, these two are surprisingly more similar than you'd think. And that was something I definitely wanted to talk about. Now, I have never done an In the Comics episode with a character before. I usually just tackle storylines, so I don't think my original format is going to fit in here very well. So what I'm going to do is split the character into categories, talk about the differences between comic book version and MCU version, and just let the differences speak for themselves. So, first thing to talk about is in this, I would say, is the category they differ the most, but they do still have some crossover. Now, one thing you need to know is that in the comic books there are two Zemos. I don't know what all my friends are talking about saying comic books are confusing and convoluted and they can't keep up. This is so simple. There's Heinrich Zemo and Helmut Zemo. And we're going to be focusing on Helmut because he's the one that was adapted for the MCU, but we do need to go over Heinrich's backstory because that is crucial to the comic version's motivation. So, Heinrich Zemo was a Nazi scientist working on vague, evil Nazi science stuff, and one of the things he was working on is a super duper glue called Adhesive X. Captain America does his usual hero thing, rushes in to stop him, the tank holding the Adhesive X breaks, and it covers Zemo, gluing his purple mask to his face. And as a result, where he had once been a supposedly loving father and husband, he turned angry and violent. And before I go on to the next bit, I just have to discuss the comics code really quickly. Now, this was a lot of pearl-clutching old men who decided that comic books were the scourge of the youth of then. So the comics code was written, which had a series of things that could and could not happen in comics, and one of them was the hero couldn't kill the villain. If the villain was gonna die, he had to die by his own evil machinations. So eventually Heinrich catches up with Cap and he tries to shoot him. Cap uses his shield to deflect and the sunlight reflects off Zemo's face, which for some reason causes him to start shooting wildly. He causes a rock slide and he dies. Right. Finally we can get to Helmut. So after Cap is unfrozen, Zemo 2.0 hones in on him because he blames Cap for 1, causing his father to become abusive, and 2, killing his father. But that's not all. Comic Zemo basically has 2 driving forces. Okay, on the to-do list, kill Captain America and take over the world. Not necessarily in that order. So yeah, comic book Zemo basically has 2 motivations. We've already covered kill Captain America, but his take over the world is a little bit more nuanced than you'd originally think, because he was raised with supremacist ideals by his Nazi father, So he genuinely believes that because he's a Zemo, he is the only one who is able to run the world effectively. And comic book writers have done a lot of interesting things with this psychology over the years. MCU Zemo starts off in a broadly similar fashion with familial motivations. He wants to take vengeance on the Avengers for destroying his family. Although comic Zemo is misdirecting his anger, both in the sense of his father becoming abusive and in the death sense, since neither of those were Cap's fault. But MCU Zemo's anger is much more rationally directed because the destruction of Sokovia was their fault. Which, if we're deciding which one's better here, I think that is considerably more interesting. But then when we move on to Falcon and the Winter Soldier, we see that Zemo has evolved, and he has not gotten over the death of his family. You don't get over something like that, but has kind of made his peace with the fact that they're gone, and has taken his energy and put it into a crusade, which is...
Super soldiers cannot be allowed to exist.
He believes wholeheartedly that super soldiers are a scourge on the world and they need to be stopped. And there is a bit of crossover between this motivation and Comic Zemo's take over the world motivation, but we'll get to that in the personality section. And this is where we start to see quite a few similarities. Comic Zemo actually debuted in Captain America issue 168 as a villain called the Phoenix. And even though each version of the character does it in a different way, the broad strokes are very similar. He targets Captain America, gets his attention, messes with his head, divides him from his partner, tricks him, gets him to the location, and then monologues the reason why he's brought them there and he wants them to suffer, which again is the death of his family. Of course, the differences here is MCU Zemo just quietly goes off to commit suicide but is stopped by Black Panther, whereas because Comic Zemo was trying to kill Captain America by dangling him over a big barrel of Adhesive X, he falls in. And I hear people say, are we going to get MCU Zemo's mask eventually glued to his face at some point? Please don't do that. Please do not cover up Daniel Bruhl's face. Please do not cover up this smirk. This I have decided to call the I know something you don't smirk. That face, those expressions, those looks are quintessential to that character now, at least in my head. Don't cover it up. You don't need to. It would ruin quite a bit of the character, and there isn't even any comic precedent for it because this is Helmut, not Heinrich. Okay, let's move on to personality. And this is the section that originally made me want to make this video because with the advent of the multiverse in the MCU, I can so easily see these two men being the same person, just people who came from very different places and as a result made very different choices. Some of which being due to the fact that Comic Zemo is a born Nazi, whereas this Zemo is apparently not a Nazi and is in fact quite anti-Nazi.
Hydra deserves its place on the ash heap, so your death would not bother me.
He seems to, as far as we know, have had a normal, loving upbringing, aristocracy aside, so you can see crossover with these two personalities. So the first thing that crops up is, of course, Zemo's arrogance. When I was talking about motivation, I said that the ultimate goal for Comic Zemo, take over the world, and the ultimate goal for MCU Zemo, wipe out super soldiers, comes from the arrogant belief that they are the only person who can get the job done. They think that this needs to be done, and they are the only person who can do it. And they've made it their crusade. Of course, though, you can say MCU Zemo's motivation is significantly more noble. But make no mistake, Comic Zemo has had his heroic moments over the years. He just never ever wavers in that unrelenting belief that the world will be better with him running the show. In fairness to him, he usually is the smartest person in any room he's in, but still, yikes. Another part of his personality is intrinsically tied to his nobility. And for both versions, I think that feeds into the arrogance. But a difference here is, for the comic book version, his family and his family name is very much tied to why he believes he's better than everyone else. Whereas MCU Zemo seems fairly uninterested in his own aristocracy other than what it can get him. He is very clearly arrogant, snobbish, and very aristocratic, but he is significantly more casual about it. So while MCU Zemo's over here waxing philosophical about super soldiers should not be allowed to exist because people put them on pedestals, and cities fly and people die, and Nietzsche said something or other. That is my Sokovian accent. Whereas comic versions over here like, I fight for the glory of the House of Zemo! And the last thing I want to talk about personality-wise is something that changed between Civil War and The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which is Zemo's attitude. Now, some people have pointed to this change and said it doesn't fit and it's drastic and everything, but I would really argue against that because in Civil War, he was in the throes of grief and anger. He's obviously not going to be acting like himself. But like I said now, we see him at a time where he is more at peace with the death of his family and has found a new purpose in life, i.e. taking out super soldiers. So him being, for lack of a better word, sassy here is not only a fine character progression within the MCU, but comic accurate. Because comic Zemo is sassy as fuck.
I'd rather face 1,000,000 bugs in front of me than risk one of your daggers in my back.
Oh, do not tease me with such beautiful imagery, Captain.
Only an American would assume a fashion-forward black man looks like a pimp.
I love this guy. He is a villain just charming enough to make you forget that he killed the King of Wakanda. Until the Wakandans show up to remind you, of course. Spoil sports. One quick personality difference that I want to talk about is comic Zemo is occasionally prone to losing his temper, whereas I can't imagine this version of Zemo so much as raising his voice. And I think that's what makes him so scary. He is just so eerily pleasant all the time. Because if you think about it, a genuinely in-control person does not need to raise their voice. So again, if we're talking which one is better, Skillset is probably the section that we're going to see the most similarities. First off, we have Master Tactician, and yes, Zemo's Civil War plan did make sense. He is arguably the best tactician in the Marvel Universe, which is what makes him so dangerous. A significant key similarity that I think defines the character probably even more than his tactical ability is his psychological ability. He is a master manipulator. He knows how to get into people's heads and he knows exactly how to exploit them. You can be the most powerful god or the lowliest human being, you are vulnerable to Zemo's manipulations. And again, that is what makes him so scary. Zemo is a great engineer and inventor, inherited from his father. We haven't seen any evidence of that in the MCU. Leadership ability, which we kind of saw in the MCU because he was a colonel in the Sokovian army, leader of a kill squad, so obviously he can lead. But those skills are significantly played up in the comic, the most significant instance of which being when he leads the supervillain team, the Thunderbolts. Well, calling them a supervillain team is a little bit inaccurate, but I know I'm known for going off on tangents. I'm not going to do that today. You can talk quite a bit about the similarities, but there are basically two main differences when it comes to skill set. Now, the next thing I'm going to say, we may have to just wait and see for Zemo's next appearance, but comic Zemo is a master swordsman. We've seen a bit of physicality and fighting ability from MCU Zemo, especially since he was a kill squad commander, but nothing involving a sword. And even though, considering how significantly more grounded this version is, it may be kind of silly to see him break out a sword, but it would also be awesome at the same time. Please just give Daniel Brühl some fencing lessons and just put him in front of a camera, please. I don't care how many stunt doubles or camera tricks you need to use, I need to see that. But the most significant difference in Skillset is that Zemo has often used his scientific ability to create enhancements for himself, which, as we know, MCU Zemo would never ever do. I mean, he gets a hold of that super soldier serum and there is no hesitation, he just immediately destroys it because he genuinely believes this is a scourge on humanity. Whereas comic Zemo would have guzzled that down like it was chocolate milk. So yeah, those are all the differences between MCU Zemo and comic Zemo, and like I said, there are a lot more similarities there than you'd originally think there'd be. But in the end, these are two very different characters. They feel like they could have come from the same source, but they made wildly different choices and as a result became wildly different men. And that's one of the things that is so great about Western comics. You can get so many different versions of one thing and all of them can have their merits. Maybe I'll talk more about the multiverse in relation to Loki in the future, but for now, I really hope you enjoyed this episode. I really hope you enjoyed this new formatting because I was really just winging it here. So in the meantime, I am going to get back to working on my Titans video coming out mid-August, and just waiting in anticipation for the next part of the long Halloween. So if you liked this video at all, if you want to check out more of them, if you want to see more of this, please comment, subscribe, like, let me know what you want to see, and I will do my best to accommodate. So thank you everyone, and I'll see you for the long Halloween.